Hey everyone, my name is Rain, and I'm going to be doing a presentation on crunch culture. And the presentation that I am giving you right now is going to be a presentation whose purpose is to bring awareness to a culture that, in my opinion, every game developer or aspiring game developer should have some knowledge about. I'm not trying to bash the game development industry, even though this presentation may come off as something like that. But I really hope it's something informative and I hope you enjoy. So, let's get into it. What the heck is crunch? Before I talk about crunch culture, we got to understand what crunch is. Well, the definition of crunch would be developers working long hours, around 65 to 80 hours, with an upwards of 100 hours weekly in order to meet deadlines. Within the game development industry, crunch is notorious because it is a common practice during games development cycle when the game needs to be refined as possible before the announced release date. Research into different studios, ranging from AAA to indie, show that crunch is considered an accepted practice, being likely to occur depending on the size of the team. Smaller groups of developers with deadlines are guaranteed to experience this sort of crunch, according to some of my research. A 2014 survey by the International Game Developers Association found that 81% of polled game developers had crunched at some point over the previous 2 years. 50% felt crunch was expected in their workplace and a normal part of their job. A 2015 survey that took place the year after, conducted by the same individuals, found that 62% of developers said that their jobs involved crunch. Of those, nearly one-third said crunch meant 50 to 59 hours of work a week. Another third said 60 to 69 hours, and just under a quarter admitted to crunching more than 70 hours a week. There were personal interviews with developers from my research indicating that 100-hour work weeks were not unheard of. Just for comparison, the legal definition of a full-time working week in Canada and the United States, where the vast majority of the survey respondents live, is 40 hours. And 44% of developers who said that they don't have crunch admitted that their job requires periods of extended hours. So even if a no crunch policy within the studio or group existed, so long as they have deadlines, they are probably going to work extra hours. And the thing is, since many game developers are salary earners and thus earn or are at least paid a fixed amount, overtime crunch that they do before the game gets released or any time that crunch is involved, it almost always goes unpaid, which in my opinion is probably the worst part. But luckily it goes to show that nowadays that kind of thing doesn't exist, but it was very prevalent within the early 2010s and to the late 2010s, around that time frame. So let's talk about the different types of crunches that exist within the game development industry. So there are common types of crunches and lesser known crunches, but both of these are still very important, and I believe that they are something that you need to know. So some of the more common types of crunches include continuous march, which is caused by poor project management in the early stages of planning development, leading to a crunch that lasts throughout the entirety of the project timeline. It's considered the most unhealthy, and it can lead to fairly disastrous consequences if developers do experience that, which I will get into later. Then there's the most common types of crunches that you'd see back then, as well as sometimes these days as well, which are short-term but very brutal crunches oriented towards the final few weeks or the final few months before the game's release. And it's typically used to refine all aspects of the game in order to ensure its promised quality during the scheduled release. Then there's the mini crunch, which is multiple crunches that take place throughout the project in no more than 2 weeks at a given time, and they are used to meet specific milestones. It's considered to be the most used to this day, since it's around the 2 week mark where crunch's costs outweigh its benefits. And that's why mini crunches are used sparingly with fairly long breaks in between. And it actually gets the benefits of crunching as well as the mitigates a lot of the disadvantages of having to crunch. And then there's lesser known types of crunches. There's delusional crunch, which is a reflection of crunch culture that doesn't involve deadlines, but instead manifests in the form of a mentality that developers, or at least senior developers, have that make them unintentionally work extra hours and days because they're used to that kind of schedule, which is fairly sad when you think about it. And then there's some of the more niche crunch, which actually is something that was very common back during the time when game developers were exploited a lot more during the early 2010s, like I mentioned before. Crunch bit got over, was when crunch wasn't considered to be worth paying overtime for, since they're already on a salary. And it's the crunch that developers self-impose and schedule intentionally. And unlike delusional crunch, which developers are unaware that they are crunching, the academics from the University of Oregon who studied this consider good crunch to be a form of cruel optimism that developers use to justify unsustainable labor practice. And the concept in more simplified terms can be boiled down to basically being a bragging match about who worked more hours and suffered the most, which is extremely sad, and I really hope that the people who experience this get the help that they need. All right, I can tell that things are becoming a little bit too slow, so I'll try and speed it up and try and speed run through what the heck causes crunch. Well, too many things. There's lots of reasons. It can be a milestone is behind schedule. Anytime a project is due for review by management, you're going to crunch. An issue comes up that prevents other people from working. A publisher decides they want to see something now, or maybe they just want new features that weren't planned previously. When a trade show or article requires a demo, a trailer, a screenshot, you name it. Financial issues cause crunch. Technical issues can cause crunch. Process issues, or just straight up an unfun game can cause you to crunch to remake a lot of its features and assets. But the most prominent reasoning behind crunch, according to statistics done by the University of Gothenburg research paper, stem from unrealistic schedules and feature creep. I myself thought, hey, that doesn't make any sense. There are project management methods out there, such as Agile, that can help adapt to new challenges during the development cycle. Well, it turns out it's a lot more complicated than that. From level designers to 3D modelers, graphic artists, and sound designers, every single job a video game calls for is right brain work. And every member of a development team has to make countless subjective decisions on a daily basis. And by nature, people will be more creative on some days than they are on others. Some days, the words, the art, the code just flow, and other days they don't. In other words, it becomes very difficult to figure out how long a given task might take, and it can cause the project manager who's assigning, or at least scheduling all this, have a lot of trouble. And even when a project manager is desperate to avoid crunch, most of the time it makes it impossible to estimate how long it may take for a narrative designer, for example, to write a scene, or for a programmer to come up with an AI tree. In general, making games is much more of a messy process than sometimes even the developers themselves assume, which makes it really inconceivable to even come up with the perfect schedule. So, how does crunch impact the developers and even the game itself? Well, the physical and mental toll of crunch time typically leads to burnout in the form of fatigue, a developer losing passion for their work, and even getting various mental health issues that are not limited to things such as depression, anxiety, and panic attacks. And there are severe cases where developers have experienced stress casualties, leading to extended absences from work due to breakdowns caused from the immense stress that long mandatory hours can lead to. And if you want to know exactly what kind of experiences certain developers went through, then check out the links in the resources slide that I have. But yeah, a 2013 survey also found that the most common reason for developers leaving the video game industry for good was because of how poor their quality of life became when they were forced to crunch for months and months on end. And there was an ex-QA tester in an interview that said he gave up on his dreams of making video games after working 60-hour weeks for a game called Civilization 3. So look into that if you want to. And it is in my opinion that part of the problem comes from the implicit and subtle pressure rather than the more forceful and explicit open pressure that developers receive from upper management to crunch in order to meet their deadlines. And it's this kind of pressure that makes developers concede and also crunch, which then influences other developers to also crunch because they don't want to be the only one who's not crunching when everyone else is crunching. And then it creates a vicious loop that takes advantage of the pride, guilt, and passion that we have for the games we make as developers. An interviewed subject from the scholarly article by the University of Gothenburg that I mentioned before stated poor time management and the inability to say no and plan, and he's talking about crunch culture in this, and it feels as though it is expected. It is built into the schedule that there will be periods of crunch where people are doing 50 to 60 hours, allowing them to get an extra man day, 2 or 3 man days out of everyone per week or per month. And for those of you who don't know, man days refers to a single person's working time for a day or the equivalent, and is generally used to measure how much work is required to perform a task. So they plan out crunches, they plan out to make it so they can squeeze as much out of developers as possible, so deadlines are met. So let's look at a case study example of a game that, let's just say, experienced continuous crunch. So a lot of you guys may know Cyberpunk. It was a game that was quite excited for among its community. And their objective, they made a lot of promises, and that's what kind of screwed them over, I would believe, where they said they would make this role-playing game with a variety of playable classes with specialized abilities alongside a massively immersive world. They didn't really follow up on that, and that was mostly because of poor planning, because they didn't really start developing Cyberpunk, even though it was announced in 2013, until 2015, after they released The Witcher 3. And CD Projekt Red has addressed this, their management, and they kind of like screwed over developers, and developers kind of fought back a bit. And yeah, let's just say that Cyberpunk is the result of very rushed work because the management couldn't really plan all too well. And what were the results? There was a huge scope and cut in scope. There was an insane number of bugs upon release, and the studio even faced a class action lawsuit from an investor because the release was so bad and their reputation just completely got ruined, and the people who invested in this game just like they probably did get their return nowadays by now, but yeah, let's just say that CD Projekt Red had to suffer for this. And I think the key takeaway from most of this presentation is that crunching through your problems is a recipe for disaster. And know that these kinds of things will happen to you when you enter the industry, and it's best that you are informed just what game development entails at a professional level. And while crunch is mostly inevitable, keep in mind that crunch culture is being fought against even to this day, and significant strides have been made over the years by many studios to push back against it. Thank you, and yeah, this is my resources. Check it out if you really want to. Have a great day.